They didn't say exactly what kind of peace treaty they were considering. We are ready to negotiate handing over a whole range of provinces in the Baltic and part of the Ukraine and Belorussia on condition that the Germans stop their advance. But Stamanov reacted to this proposition with greater dignity than the others. He said, "What are you doing? Even if you retreat all the way to the Urals, you will still beat Hitler. Why are you doing this?"
While Stalin contemplates a way out of the war, he's drawing up plans to punish his own troops if they surrender. In a desperate attempt to halt the rout, he issues Order Number 270. All officers and political officials taken prisoner at the front are to be considered traitors. If ever they return to the Soviet Union, they will be arrested and executed. But the barbarity of Order 270 does not stop there. The wives of captured troops also face imprisonment in the Gulag. This savage order will claim thousands of victims before the end of the war. They will even include members of Stalin's own family. In the first weeks of the war, Stalin's son, Yakov Djugashvili, is captured by the Germans. A month later, Yakov's wife is arrested under Order 270 and exiled to a camp in Siberia.
There was a panic in the first years of the war. A lot of people were surrendering, and so a law was introduced to prevent it to a certain extent. It was, of course, a harsh law, but these were harsh times. They arrested the wives of all the officers who surrendered. I don't know if this applied to the children as well, but this law was passed and announced to the army. My mother spent 2 years in prison because of this law and was later released. My grandfather did help us again later, but there could be no allowances made for the law.
Now, with Moscow in range of the Luftwaffe, Stalin's own citadel of power comes directly under attack. The city's defenses are prepared. Barrage balloons are set up to disrupt German bombing. A round-the-clock watch is set up. But the Luftwaffe penetrates the defenses to bomb the center of the city, forcing citizens to take shelter in the subway. Above them, German aircraft cause terrible damage and suffer relatively few losses themselves. Though Soviet propaganda makes the most of those few. This Heinkel is displayed for Muscovites outside the Bolshoi Theater. Outside Moscow, German armies race for the capital. Elsewhere, Army Group North heads for Leningrad. Army Group Center makes a pincer movement towards Smolensk. Army Group South strikes towards Kiev and the Ukraine. Adept at the use of terror to gain political control, Stalin's touch in military matters is less sure. In these early weeks of war, he constantly ignores the advice of his generals, and the blood of literally countless Soviet soldiers is sacrificed to his megalomania. The suburbs of Kiev, the beginning of August. In a vast pincer movement, German Army Group South threatens to encircle the city. General Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, wants to retreat east of Kiev out of the pincer's claws. Zhukov supports Kirponos, knowing that this tactic alone will save the Southwestern Front. But of course Stalin has the final say, and he does not listen to generals. Dismissing their fears, he orders the two commanders to defend Kiev at any cost. Kiev is and always will be Soviet, he insists. It is a deadly error. During August and the first 2 weeks of September, the Wehrmacht encircles a vast area crammed with Red Army troops. Thousands of square miles gripped in the German vice. 4 Soviet armies perish. Kirponos dies in combat. Hundreds of thousands of men are captured. A massive haul of weapons and equipment is seized. Yet even at such a cost, Kiev is not saved. On the 18th of September, the city falls, a battered carcass for Hitler to gloat over. The Führer is now lord of all he surveys. It seems as if he is on course to meet his objective, to crush Stalin's Russia before winter sets in. Far to the north of Kiev, Hitler knows that Leningrad also lies in mortal peril. Army Group North's charge across the Baltics, under the command of Field Marshal von Leb, means that the city is now within the Führer's grasp. For an entire month, Red Army troops isolated in Tallinn, the last bastion before Leningrad, have been fighting to hold the German advance from the south. But in the face of the Wehrmacht's blistering assault, they can fight no longer. Their only option is to evacuate by sea. But it will be an evacuation without air cover, across a heavily mined sea, under bombardment from German coastal artillery and the Luftwaffe. "16 ships, 34 transports, and innumerable men are lost in the operation. Leningrad lies ahead of the Wehrmacht, defenseless. German aerial forces are now concentrated for the attack. Day after day, the city is pounded by the Luftwaffe. Hitler wants Leningrad wiped from the face of the earth, but its citizens keep the city alive. As September draws to a close, Leningrad is totally cut off, with no land link left to the Soviet Union. The city's defense committee is in crisis. Now, at last, the gravity of the situation in the north penetrates the Kremlin. Stalin concludes that Voroshilov, commander of Red Army forces in Leningrad, is failing in his duty. To prevent the second city's fall, Stalin summons Zhukov and orders him to take command in Leningrad. It is vital to rally the spirits of Leningrad's citizens, to mobilize its entire population. Zhukov cancels Voroshilov's pessimistic directives. Reversing an order to scuttle the Baltic fleet, Zhukov ordered his guns to be turned against the enemy. And factories, mined to self-destruct in the event of capitulation, are ordered back into production. Further south, German Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal von Bock, is aimed at Moscow. But the city of Smolensk stands in its way. 10 Soviet divisions, caught in the deadly noose of another encirclement, hold the enemy at bay for 10 whole weeks. Before, inevitably, they too are overwhelmed. And so the advance on Moscow continues. It too is marked for utter oblivion, and a vast artificial lake is to be created in its place. At the end of September, the Führer launches Operation Typhoon, the final drive along the road to Moscow. Its aim? To encircle the Soviet army by driving both north and south of the Moscow highway, the pincers closing at Vyazma. It is an attack on the grand scale. The front stretches for more than 400 miles. 14 German tank and 74 infantry divisions, a total of 1.8 million officers and men, take part in the offensive. General Konyev was commander of the Red Army's Western Front.
Early in the morning of the 2nd of October, the German High Command made a strike against the Western and Reserve fronts. By the 7th of October, thanks to the enemy's clear numerical superiority, their tank maneuvers, and their mechanized mobility, we were surrounded in the Vyazma region on the Moscow-Minsk highway.
Stalin has good cause for panic now. Facing a disaster that might sweep away the whole Soviet Union, Stalin calls for the one general with an unbroken record of success. He summons Zhukov to the Kremlin.
I arrived in Moscow in the evening and made straight for Stalin's apartments in the Kremlin. Stalin had the flu, but he was still working. He greeted me with a nod of his head and suggested that I look at a map, and then said, "So, what is the situation in the West? I can't get a clear report of what's going on at the moment, where the enemy is, where our troops are. So, if you can go immediately to the headquarters of the Western Front, work out what the situation is, and phone me at any time, day or night, well, I'll be waiting for your call."
3 days later, on the 10th of October, Zhukov delivers a report laden with doom. Nothing stands between Hitler's armies and Moscow.
To the west, especially in the Western Front sector, the situation was very serious. All the roads to Moscow were effectively open to the enemy. The only so-called positive news was that the main part of the German forces were pinned down by the activity of our troops surrounded in an area to the northwest of Vyazma.
Stalin orders Zhukov to assume command of the Western Front, hoping that somehow he can prevent the Germans from taking the capital. He blames the debacle on Konev, who seems certain to go the way of Pavlov. Konev's fate hangs by a thread.
At that time, I was an adjutant, officer for special tasks, to Konev, the commander of the Western Front. And I had heard a telephone conversation between Stalin and Zhukov. They were discussing what should happen to Konev. So then the meeting took place. We had no idea what was on the agenda. Nothing had been sent to us by that time. But later, when Zhukov, on the 10th of October, reported the situation back to Stalin, Stalin told him that they had decided to unite the forces of the two fronts and appoint Zhukov as the commander-in-chief. Stalin also said that the commission would deal with Konev and would probably pass his case to the Revolutionary Tribunal. This, as far as I understand it, was Zhukov's reply. He said, Pavlov was shot, but that changed nothing. The situation at the front didn't improve. Therefore, I don't recommend you to do the same to Konev. He is an immensely experienced and clever man, strong-willed and capable of establishing order. I request that you appoint him as my deputy.
Having saved Konev's life, Zhukov turns to the salvation of Moscow with the same charisma, energy and ruthlessness he has shown in the defense of Leningrad. The total Red Army force at his disposal, all he has to hold the 150-mile Western Front, now stands at 90,000 troops. Weeks earlier, it had been 800,000. The number of Soviet troops taken prisoner has now reached 3 million. Zhukov has no alternative but to seek his soldiers elsewhere. And he sets about recruiting civilians to Moscow's defense. In the chill of winter's overture, 450,000 Muscovites, men, women, children and old age pensioners, dig anti-tank ditches and expand the city's defenses. A people's militia is formed from academics, writers, students, and those kept from the front by age or disability. Few will live long. They have absolutely no military experience, and there is no time left to train them in more than the bare rudiments. Zhukov fears for Moscow.
Were we confident at the staff headquarters at the front that we could hold our line of defense and to stop the enemy at the Mozhaisk border? I have to say, straight away, that we did not have total confidence.
Podolsk, 30 miles from Moscow, the 14th of October. The Soviet officer cadet unit makes one last desperate attempt to halt the German advance. For a few crucial hours, they frustrate the enemy. But by the time the panzers roll past them, every cadet in the unit is dead. Some are just 16 or 17, true heroes. Members of the Soviet government are less willing to die for their country. On the morning of the 16th of October, certain that Moscow is about to be overrun, the bureaucrats quit the capital for Kuybyshev on the Volga, some 400 miles east. Stalin has his own bunker ready there, but at the last moment he decides to remain in Moscow. He has been given Zhukov's assurance that the city will not fall. Triggered by rumors of the government's escape, panic has engulfed the streets of Moscow. Expecting Nazi rule at any moment, civilians flee Moscow in their thousands, laying siege to the city's eastbound railway stations. Yevgeny Gromov, art critic and native Muscovite, was only 10, but he remembers the day well.
It's strange, but I always associate the 16th of October with gunfire. There should not have been any at that time, but even today it sticks in my memory. It was a frightening and dreadful day. My parents had a feeling that something was going to happen. I can't recall too much, but I do remember people rushing down Taganskaya Street carrying sacks. And I even remember someone carrying a children's bath filled with something or other. My friends told me, I did not see it myself, that at the meat factory where my mother worked, and she told me about it later as well, that people were looting from the shop floor, and people were walking about with strings of salami around their necks. And there, at the top of Taganskaya Street, where there's a poultry shop now, there used to be a bakery at the time. Well, this bakery was looted. But this wasn't because people just wanted to steal. It was simply because people were hungry, and there was a general feeling that the Germans would be here any minute anyway. And so people took the bread so that they'd have something to fall back on.
The Soviet Union's Western allies hold their breath and pray for the city. Even in London, children sing for Russia. To most, it seems Moscow must fall, as Warsaw, Paris and Belgrade have already fallen. But on the outskirts of Moscow, the Germans meet an obstacle on their final drive to the Kremlin. General Panfilov mounts a valiant last stand. 28 men from his division stop 50 tanks and enter Soviet history books. But the files show Panfilov had little choice. Directive to Panfilov from Marshal Zhukov. I warn you that if you let the enemy through, we shall arrest you and shoot you. Either way, he is condemned to death. During the last week of October, as Stalin contemplates the twilight outside his dacha, he decides to visit the front, now just a few hours' drive away.
Stalin made his first visit to the front in October 1941. Well, as you know, the situation in October was extremely difficult. The Germans were tearing their way towards Moscow, and we were in a tight spot. Over 500,000 of our troops were surrounded near Vyazma. They had thrown everything they had at the front, patching equipment together as best they could. Zhukov quite often didn't even have enough reserve battalions to stop all the gaps in the front. And all this time, hundreds of thousands of NKVD troops were being deployed as prison guards in Siberia, the Urals, and other areas. All these guards and their prisoners could have been fighting Hitler instead. This was the darker side of the system. No one suggested that Stalin should go to the front. There were only 3 vehicles, his bodyguards' cars and his armoured car. But just as they turned off the Volokolampsky road, his armoured car got bogged down and they couldn't shift it. This was about 20 to 25 kilometres from the front. It was already getting dark and the sky was lit up by gunfire as serious fighting was going on in the area. He'd seen all he needed to see. He waited a few minutes, climbed into a different car, and then went back to Moscow. So his first trip to the front was purely symbolic. But he claimed and wrote later that he'd been to the front anyway. For the sake of history, he had to say that he'd been to the front.
The front now lies along the Moscow-Volga Canal, the last obstacle before the capital. Battling to hold off another encirclement, the Red Army, pressed up against the canal, has nowhere left to retreat. They have one last hope, that the weather will save them. Sleet is turning to snow. The ground, frozen at night, is now a quagmire during the day, paralyzing Hitler's overstretched war machine. On the 2nd of December, German units reach Krasnaya Polyana, 17 miles from the center of Moscow. They halt at the anti-tank defenses erected by Moscow citizens. The Soviet capital is well within the range of their heavy artillery. But German generals know they no longer have time on their side. Hitler has gambled that Russia will be beaten before the winter strikes. And his armies are not designed for this bitter cold. As the weather intensifies and temperatures plummet, the bleak truth is that the Germans have only days now before time turns decisively against them. In the suburbs of modern Moscow, the tank traps still stand guard. Gaunt reminders to Muscovites that Nazi invaders once menaced the very heart of Mother Russia. In the dark days of autumn 1941, the summer's defeats have decimated the Red Army, and Hitler's artillery can strike Moscow itself. The Soviet Union seems on the brink of total defeat. But Stalin has his back to the wall, and he will stop at nothing to protect his power base. General Rokossovsky, then commanding an army just west of Moscow, experienced the power of Stalin's resolve at first hand.
Comrade Stalin called me during the night. The situation was pretty difficult. Our units had already fallen back in a number of areas. We knew that the commander-in-chief would probably give us such a dressing down that we would feel sick, and so I picked up the receiver of the special line with some trepidation. He asked me one question. Are you aware, Comrade Commander, that the enemy has occupied Krasnaya Polyana? And are you aware that if Krasnaya Polyana is occupied, it means that the Germans can bombard any point of the city of Moscow? At dawn the next day, Krasnaya Polyana was liberated in a two-pronged attack, and two 300mm guns were captured, which had been positioned by the Germans to shell the city.
The Wehrmacht is almost at the gates. But as Hitler's propaganda proclaims imminent victory and citizens prepare to meet a renewed assault, Stalin is waging his own campaign for Soviet hearts and minds. Stalin's eve of anniversary address will take place as usual, but from the safety of Mayakovsky subway station. And on the night of November the 6th, Moscow's military and party elites gather in the marbled metro. Ushered to Stalin's side, Marshal Budony knows he is out of favor. Malenkov, Beria, Molotov, Kaganovich, all applauding the man they fear.
Период мирного строительства кончился.
He can hardly conceal the extent of Soviet defeats, but Stalin does claim 4.5 million German casualties. Red Army losses, he says, are only about a third as high. And Germany is on the point of collapse. Alexei Rabin was a member of the dictator's wartime personal security team. Always close to the heart of events in Moscow, and particularly friendly with Moscow District Commander Artemyev, Rabin has ended decades of silence to shed light on Stalin's insistence that anniversary celebrations for the revolution must go ahead, no matter what the cost.
So
Colonel General Artemyev told us how it all happened. On the 31st of October 1941, Stalin called for him and said, "Are you planning to hold the parade on Red Square?" And Artemyev answered, "What parade, Comrade Stalin? Where are we to get the tanks and troops?" "Do you mean to tell me you haven't got any?" replied Stalin. Then Artemyev asked him, "Comrade Stalin, what if they bomb the parade? If the Germans break through and bomb the parade?" Stalin replied, "In the first place, you won't let a single plane through to Moscow. It's true that the weather was helping. Sleet was falling in big flakes. But Artemyev persisted. But just supposing they do start bombing." And Stalin said, "Clear away the dead and wounded and continue with the parade."
At the next day's Red Square parade, listeners hear Stalin invoke the names of military heroes that served the Tsars. Now, his very survival requires their patriotic support and sacrifice. No talk this year of socialist values or revolutionary pride.
The enemy is not as strong as some frightened and small-minded intellectuals think. The devil is not as black as he is painted. There is no doubt that Germany cannot endure such a strain for long. A few months more, perhaps half a year or a year, and Hitler's Germany will collapse under the weight of its crimes.
But do they believe him? Artillery cadet Ivanikin didn't.
It was the parade in 41. It was winter, or rather it was November, but the snow was bitterly cold and it was dark. As we paraded across Red Square, I was somewhere in the fifth line on the right flank, with my eyes facing to the right. And I was surprised that Stalin looked so short in his hat and ear flaps, not at all like the man we had seen in the portraits everywhere. So at the bottom of my heart, I felt a little dubious when he said that the war would be over in 6 months to a year. Despite all this, we understood full well that this war would continue for more than 6 months to a year.
But Stalin's words impress his worried allies, and it doesn't matter what the troops think. Few of them will live that long. They'll be marching straight from the parade to the front. Because as the snows deepen, the new German offensive is almost ready to begin. the Wehrmacht has reason to be confident in its preparations. For more than 2 years of war, it has been invincible. And most of its commanders believe, like Hitler, that the Red Army is already as good as beaten. As they look forward to battle and to winter quarters in the Soviet capital, Nazi propaganda shows them cheerful, accustomed to victory. Only a few of their commanders have noted worrying signs of exhaustion, of poor preparation for a winter campaign that was not supposed to be necessary. For most, though, the weather is still a source of simple amusement. Surely nothing can save Moscow now. Yet Leningrad, almost completely surrounded since the early autumn, is already facing the deadly wrath of the Wehrmacht, and it is still holding out. To preserve his infantry, Hitler has ordered his heaviest artillery and fleets of Luftwaffe bombers to annihilate Leningrad from afar. And as its proud avenues crumble before the onslaught, the old Tsarist capital becomes a city besieged. Stalin has no personal commitment to saving Leningrad, and his eventual order for its defense is more of a death sentence than a rallying cry, as Leningrad streets themselves become the front line. Troops are everywhere, fighting an endless succession of fires. Desperate to plug gaps in shattered perimeters. And a downpour of incendiaries forces civilians to behave like soldiers, their homes a battlefield, their lives hanging on quick reflexes, or simple good fortune. War rages all around them. Their shattered city is already hell on earth. But there is much worse to come for the millions trapped in Leningrad as hell freezes over. As temperatures plummet, the city's embattled population is plunged into the full horror of siege conditions. Now the ice and bitter cold turn even the simplest everyday task into an odyssey. And as water pipes freeze solid and explode, citizens must scavenge precious supplies from nature's jealous grasp. Transport systems grind to a complete halt. Ice penetrates every corner of the city, chilling its very lifeblood and trapping everything in its deadly grasp. Almost no fuel is reaching Leningrad, and that means death to its citizens. Soon, they will burn their furniture, their books, their most precious belongings, just to stay alive. The city seems almost dead, its people shuffling shadows in a glacial twilight. They are cold, tired, and afraid. But above all, they are starving. Bread, the Soviet people's staff of life, and their birthright in a nation of grain fields. But in Leningrad, at the very start of winter, rations are down to 4.5 ounces per day, and the so-called bread, mixed with sawdust, tastes foul. Now even glue has become a delicacy. Stirred and fried as a pancake in engine oil, old paint, anything they can find that might nourish their children in this hour when death seems to have vanquished civilization. They are dying everywhere, almost casually. Frozen bodies in the streets, unattended, commonplace. Even death is disorganized. Historian Dmitry Likhachov was there.
People used to think that those who died during the siege were all buried in the Piskaryovskaya cemetery, but that is not true. They are buried all over the city in all the cemeteries. You see those fields? They are all graves. They are all colossal mass graves dug out with machines and full of naked people, one on top of the other, all the way to the trees over there. My own father is buried here. So many people died completely unnecessarily, and it is impossible to say what their numbers were. There have been attempts to give an exact count, but we cannot really establish the figures even to the nearest 1,000. That is because when the Germans surrounded Leningrad, people fled to Leningrad from the suburbs and outlying regions such as Novgorod and Pskov. Nobody knew who they were. They had no official passports, or if they did, they didn't get registered. So they didn't get ration cards, and they started to die as early as September. Leningrad was surrounded by a ring of refugee camps full of peasants fleeing the enemy. When the frosts came, you could see children's hands reaching out of their carts, begging for bread. That ring of camps around Leningrad was a horrific sight. They all died, every single one of them. A large slice of the blame has to be laid at the feet of the authorities of the time, the Regional Party Committee and Leningrad City's Soviet Executive Committee. We are told that people got 200 grams of bread a day, but they didn't. In order to get that ration, you literally had to fight your way into the bread shop, to fight your way in, having stood in line the whole of the night before. But at nights, there was a curfew, you see. So the people would hide in stairways and porches, and as soon as the curfew was over, people would race for the bread shops to collect their 50, 100 or 200 grams of bread, depending on how many coupons they had with them. I and my children survived thanks only to my wife. The Germans saw only too clearly what the situation was like in Leningrad and decided to bomb the Badayev warehouses. That was a completely demoralizing sight. It meant we would starve.
Today, at Leningrad Seraphim Cemetery, the hunger is not forgotten. But the wartime Soviet Union was never told the full story. Yuri Kolosov survived the siege as a schoolboy. Now he is director of the Leningrad Siege Museum.
From November to December, when the starvation really began to bite and the death rate went up by 10 or 15 times, the first proposals for mass burials were made. And these burials regularly took place in all 22 of the city's cemeteries.
Archivist Nadezhda Cherepina has been studying the siege from secret documents hidden until the fall of the Soviet Union.
The cemeteries could no longer cope with the huge number of burials because of the severe frosts, the growing weakness of the grave diggers, and the severe lack of machinery. So a decision was taken to cremate the corpses. On the 7th of March 1942, a reduced sitting of the Leningrad City Soviet Executive Committee decided to organize the cremation of corpses at the First City Brick Factory.
It was reported that 223,000 bodies were burnt at the brick factory. The ashes were scattered over the whole area of this park. The brick factory had been here before there was a park. And they dumped the ashes into the ponds that used to be here. So you and I are standing on ground that is made up of those dumped ashes. The ashes were literally blown away by the wind over this ground. So we decided, at the suggestion of the Leningrad Siege Society, to set up a memorial. It is very sad that we don't even know the names of the people who were cremated here.
And even now, Dmitry Likhachov can only guess at the final death toll in Leningrad.
By August, there had been 1,200,000 officially registered deaths. But, as I mentioned earlier, there were huge numbers of unregistered deaths, and it's impossible to say exactly how many. People would often hide the deaths of their relatives from the authorities in order to use their ration cards. My own estimate, as a person who was in the siege and witnessed it all, is that around 2 million people died.
2 million deaths. The ice settles like a veil, mourning the lost souls of Leningrad. And survivors, chilled to the marrow, can only shuffle around, fighting death and despair. And amid tragedy on such a vast scale, a few anguished citizens plumb the very depths of human degradation.
Основная причина огромной смертности в городе Ленинграде страшно повлияла на психику отдельных горожан.
Starvation was the main reason for the very high death rate in Leningrad. It took a dreadful toll on the minds of some citizens. Many of them couldn't take the ordeal and sank into cannibalism. Their numbers were not great, not very great. In a city of 2 or 3 million people, there were only a few hundred people. From archive documents, we can roughly calculate the number of cannibals, people who murdered in order to get bodies, and who ate people, and people who ate dead bodies. Most of them were women, and you have to understand that they were doing it to try and save their children. The total number of these criminals was around 1,500. Until recently, this wasn't normally talked about. In general, in most cases, each incident had a personal tragedy behind it. We have a document which reflects the state of cemeteries at that time.
В общем-то, в большинстве случаев, за каждым таким событием стоит большая трагедия.
Here's a report on the Giovsky Cemetery. Up to 3,000 bodies were dumped and scattered over the area allocated to the communal graves. Along the road between this area and the cotton depot, there were decapitated corpses and various limbs and detached body parts, heads, hands, feet, etc.
This document has never been seen in public before.
Here we have a special police report. 24th of January, an operational unit of the Pagolova Police Detachment, having received secret information, carried out a search of the buildings of a refugee settlement in Pagolova School Number 2. During the search, the body of a 12-year-old boy was found, without a head and with the inner parts of his body removed. Also found were human legs belonging to both children and adults, 2 children's heads, and other different body parts.
But though Leningrad's brutal winter is humanity's enemy, it is no friend to Hitler. North of the city, Lake Ladoga freezes solid in late November, and thick ice forms a land link to the motherland through the one area not held by the Wehrmacht. They call it the Road of Life. It carries a precious trickle of food to the starving millions, brings out helpless women and children, and offers a slender lifeline to those that must remain in the beleaguered city, despite the savage attentions of the Luftwaffe. But it is never enough. At best, the road of life can only provide 1/3 of Leningrad's daily food needs. And those are just the official figures. At the start of 1942, Leningrad hovers somewhere between life and death. They have already been written off by Hitler. There is no need to take Leningrad, he tells the Bundestag. Within a few weeks, the city will devour itself. But in these bleakest hours, Leningrad survivors seek nourishment of the mind and of the soul through culture.
You probably know my book, Defense of Ancient Russian Cities. Well, I wrote this book together with Madame Tikhanova during the siege in Leningrad. How did it come about? Well, I was summoned to party headquarters at Smolny. I wasn't a party member, but I was summoned there. And to get there, I had to cross the whole city. Well, I had so little energy that I could hardly drag my feet along. But I still went to Smolny. When I went in, the first thing that struck me was the smell of the canteen, which meant that people were eating there. I was met by a woman, I won't call her fat, but let's just say she was a healthy, hearty-looking woman, the head of some department or other. She told me that a book was needed to raise the spirits of people in Leningrad. So I agreed to the commission, because I didn't think of the commission as coming from her, but more directly from the people of Leningrad, who were the ones who really needed it. So I went home, barely dragging my feet along. That woman in Smolny didn't even think of feeding me. None of them did. And it took me all day to get there and back.
Authors, artists, all still working. Architect Alexander Nikolsky, his triumphal arch, a gesture of faith in victory. And the great composer Dmitri Shostakovich, completing his immortal Leningrad Symphony, as the city of its inspiration is ripped apart around him. As a symbol of defiance, the work's first performance must take place in Leningrad. Musicians are recalled from the front, but conductor Eliasberg faces unique problems during rehearsals. The orchestra administrator's report is terse, but it tells the story. The first violin is dying. The drum died on the way to work. The French horn is about to die. And yet, in the bomb-damaged Philharmonia Hall, Leningrad Symphony soars above the mayhem, announcing the triumph of art over death. 25 years later, touching proof that mere mortals defy death less easily. Survivors of the original orchestra and of that first night audience gather to commemorate the siege. Eliasberg leads them once more. And empty places are reserved for the dead. It is a performance of ghosts under the wistful eye of the composer. And as they pay tribute to the dead, Surely, too, they remember Leningrad's children. Innocent, terrified victims of Hitler's crimes. Thousands of children lose their lives in the siege. But so many more are touched by death before they have discovered life. Learning to grieve for loved ones, to endure hunger, fear, cold and pain. But the children will leave behind their own poignant contribution to Leningrad's siege history. Little Tanya Savicheva keeps a diary of her family under siege. Just a small address book, a friend or relative mentioned under each letter heading. It is a stark, heartbreaking testimony. A simple, unadorned catalogue of calamities. Grandmother died 25 January 1942 at 3 p.m. Laka died on 17 March at 5 in the morning. Uncle Vasya died on 13 April at 2 in the morning. Mama died on 13 May 1942 at 7:30 in the morning. The Savichevs have died. All died. Only Tanya is left. And though she is evacuated along the road of life, it is too late to reverse the fatal effects of malnutrition. But like Anna Frank in the West, she will not be forgotten. Tanya Savicheva's words will be read at the Nuremberg trials and will help damn her killers in the eyes of all humanity. It has seemed an eternity, but spring is coming to Leningrad at last. It brings survivors a glimpse of better things, some real hope to fuel their dauntless spirits. Now the city is a hive of activity again. There is hard work to be done. But with most of the men, the main burden falls, as it has done throughout the siege, on the indomitable women of Leningrad. These women are helping to restart the city's tram network. Yet another stubborn gesture, and one that will force German observers to question their faith in Leningrad's downfall. Others labor to bring forth spring's bounty, transforming every patch of soil anywhere in the city into priceless cropland. As the road of life once more becomes a waterway, the spring's first convoys force a passage through the melting ice on Ladoga. A new pipeline is laid under the lake, ensuring at least some regular oil supplies. Ships and barges arrive laden with relief supplies, but depart crowded with women and children, emerging at last from the shadow of death. These children are almost safe now, but the danger is not quite over. The Luftwaffe awaits them on their journey across Ladoga. Nobody will ever know how many innocent children are lost to air attacks. But after